This is Open to Debate. I'm John Donvan. Hi, everybody. You've heard me say many times that Open to Debate takes the view that good argument can actually reduce polarization. And that may sound like a paradox, but we argue that it is not, because we are emphasizing good argument, by which we mean argument that's based on facts and reasoning, clear reasoning, logic, even an ability to listen to one another with maybe the possibility of finding some common ground. Delivering exactly that is our mission. And so is trying to understand better the sources of polarization, which we all know is more extreme in the U.S. today than in most of our history. Why is that? And for that matter, what does history itself reveal about those times when societies have been upended and torn apart by political discord? In this episode, I'm talking to Fareed Zakaria on this very question. Fareed is a well-known journalist who writes a weekly column for the Washington Post. He's currently the host of Fareed Zakaria GPS on CNN. And in addition to all of this, he's also a best-selling author many times over. And his latest book looks precisely at these moments of upheaval and change that I'm talking about. It is called The Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present. But I promise we'll spend most of our time in the present. Fareed Zakaria, thanks so much for joining me on Open to Debate.
Pleasure to be with you, John.
And you've debated with us many, many years ago. It's great to have you back again. I just wanted to point that out. And I also wanted to pledge to you that I have read your book. I've read every sparkling word. So I have a good sense of the argument you were making. And if I were to look at one lens through which I think you present these stories of various revolutions over the last 400 years, one lens is that you look at the way in which revolutions have led to realignments of groups of people into parties and to movements, and how those groups of people and parties of movements have clashed with each other, learned from each other, evolved over time to some degree, evolved into one another. But that I think your basic argument is we are going through one of those times now. But I'd like to get to your starting point in deciding even to look at this issue of revolutions. How far back does your thinking go on this?
So I began to think about it about 10 years ago. And it was the rise of the Tea Party that got me interested, because I thought I was seeing something very unusual in American politics, which was a kind of bottom-up insurgency that was taking over really the most hierarchical party in the American political system. You know, there's that old saying about presidential nominations that Democrats fall in love when they nominate a president. You know, think of Kennedy, Clinton, Obama, but Republicans fall in line. This is a party that 5 times nominated Richard Nixon on its presidential ticket. If you add Richard Nixon and the Bush family, basically that's most of the last 50 or 60 years. And yet this very hierarchical party was being upended from the bottom up. And the issues that seemed to matter to the people who constituted the Tea Party were not traditional Republican issues, even though they talked a little bit about economics. There's a very good book about this by Theda Skocpol, a Yale scholar. It turns out it was mostly a kind of cultural reaction and a cultural backlash to a very fast-changing America. So it's not an accident that the Tea Party springs up after the first black family enters the White House. It's not an accident that it comes after 30 years of massive expansion of globalization. It's not an accident that it comes with the information revolution that really transforms work so that knowledge workers get massively well compensated, and people who work with their hands lose the kind of bargaining power that labor has often had. So I was looking at this and thinking, so this is a kind of cultural backlash to living through revolutionary times. When has it happened before? And, you know, one thing led to another, and I found myself starting with the Dutch in the 17th century.
Okay, let's talk about the word revolution. As you point out, its meaning changed. I'm going to make a pun in advance here. Its meaning changed about 180 degrees.
Yeah, you know, it started out as a scientific concept. You know, the Earth revolves around the sun, and in that sense, it means moving in a fixed pattern on a set orbit and returning to the original position. You know, that is what revolution meant. And very quickly it takes on this meaning that we now think of it commonly, and certainly in the political world, of a sharp upheaval, a sharp break. But what I find interesting is that it's always had elements of both meanings. So when the first kind of major use of the word revolution is Copernicus, who talks about a revolution. And he's talking about a revolution in the scientific sense, but what he is doing, his theories are revolutionary in the sense of breaking with the past, breaking with the idea that the earth was at the center of the universe. And he says, no, the sun is. But you can even look at the modern use of the word revolution. So many people who think of themselves as revolutionaries are often promising to take you back. Think about Donald Trump. The most important words on his slogan is "Make America Great Again." So it's really a politics of revolution that says, I'm going to take you back before all this upheaval. I'm going to take you back to when things were quieter and you didn't feel this sense of deep disruption and alienation.
And so your hunch was that you could find in these past events some early warning of what we're going through now, in the sense of the way people aligned with one another, the way they grouped in one another, their values, etc. That we've seen those kinds of upheavals before. And you go all the way back to 1600 for what you call the Dutch Revolution. And it's one that I think is probably, for most readers of the book, the one that they're least familiar with. But why did you start with the Dutch in 1600?
Because it really is the beginning of the modern world. If you look at, simple way to think about it is average income. And we have, believe it or not, we have pretty good data for the last 2,000 years. Average income for people on the planet Earth is flat for about 1,600 years of that period. It's about $300 per capita GDP. And then around the 1600s, it starts to move up. And then you see this extraordinary uptick where it goes from roughly $300 per capita GDP to, I think we're now at about 5,000. That's the average for global income. The U.S. is, of course, at 70-odd thousand. But when that happens first in the Netherlands, and it happens because for the first time, wealth creation for a society happens not because of agriculture or conquest, which are really extraction industries, but it happens through innovation. And the Dutch have to innovate because they have terrible land. It's the least arable land in Europe. They have to reclaim it from the sea. And in doing that, they find ways to cooperate and to innovate. And then they invent ships, and they invent tall ships and navigation. And that produces the burst of globalization, the first real burst of globalization. And then they innovate financially. They create the first joint stock company in the world, the Dutch East Indies Company. They create the first stock market in the world, and they become the richest country in Europe, which means the richest country in the world. By the end of that century, Amsterdam is 4 times richer per capita than Paris. So, and then that produces political innovation, because they now start to think of themselves as different from the other places. It's very interesting how identity often changes when you have these things. You get a kind of identity revolution as well. They start to think of themselves as Dutch. They start to think of themselves as Protestant, not part of the Habsburg Empire, not part of the Catholic Christendom. And the political innovation is you're living in a world of kings and courts, and the Dutch have no king. They don't even really have a prime minister or president of what we would think of today. It's a decentralized system where people, basically local chieftains, local merchants cooperate. So you put all that together, and it was the first modern nation. And then that Dutch model ends up getting transported to England, and that becomes the leading power in the world, and then globalizes the model everywhere. But the pattern that you see with the Dutch recurs, which is technology and economics produce massive disruption in society. This produces an identity revolution, scrambling the politics of the age, and it always produces a backlash.
So that word scrambling sounds like it applies to everything. It applies to technology. It applies to the way people see themselves. It applies to the kinds of political innovations that they come up with. And that, just so I understand it and help our audience understand, I think that's what you mean by the core characteristics of something that qualifies as a revolution. So an uprising is not a revolution. A revolt is not. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's my it's what I'm doing is I'm creating a definition to help us understand why we are living through this kind of this period of turmoil. I don't claim it's the only way you can use the word revolution. There are obviously many different ways you could use it.
And part of the dynamic, and you've referred to this, something happens, things change, things in a move in a certain direction, and then there's a backlash. And the backlash is where that, what we're going through now, polarization, starts to find its seeds. So talk about, even with the Dutch, was there a backlash to all of this modernization, to all of this disruption? Do we see that pattern coming in as early as 1600s?
Absolutely. So the Dutch become, as I say, the most urbanized country in Europe, the wealthiest country in Europe, a country where they embraced diversity. They, for example, welcomed Jews and basically refugees from the religious wars in Europe were all welcome. There's a historian who says that Amsterdam was the most liberal city in the world in the 17th century, and I think that's reasonably true. And they developed out of all that in Dutch politics a sense of, we've gone too far. We've destroyed our traditions too much. We need to go back to the old ways. And there was a party called the States Party that promised, in a sense, to make the Netherlands great again, to say, let's go back to when it was, when there was less chaos, less turmoil, and less of the social disruption. So it was sort of the slightly more aristocratic party in the Dutch system, and party may be too strong a word, but faction within the Dutch system. But there were others saying, no, let's just move forward. The aggressive capitalistic merchants who really wanted to keep pushing forward. And you see that same pattern recur in the Industrial Revolution in Britain, where there was a very strong let's call it anti-liberal movement, starting in the right. The old landed aristocracy, the church, the clergy, the traditional conservative, the Tory party in many ways starts out as a reaction, a cultural reaction, a cultural backlash to the industrialization of Britain.
Does the word polarization then apply to what happened in the Netherlands and what happened in Britain during the Industrial Revolution?
Oh, I think for sure, because you have factions and you have, the kind of political oppositional movements that so characterize modern politics. I think that what tends to make these polarization more intense, and this is more true of our age than it was of some of those other periods, is that we are going through a period where the nature of the scrambling of our politics is that we are going from a politics that used to be defined largely along economic lines, the kind of left-right divide, which, for the last 100 years was really the way you thought of where you stood politically. So, if you were left-wing, you wanted more taxes, more government involvement in the economy. If you were right-wing, you wanted fewer taxes, less government involvement in the economy. That divide has been scrambled. And now I argue that it's more of a divide along cultural issues of kind of openness and closeness. There are some economic issues there, openness to globalization, immigration, diversity, change, technology versus people who want to shut it down. And when politics becomes more cultural, it becomes much more polarized because you can't split the difference. See, John, if you and I had a debate on economics, you want to spend $100 billion, I want to spend zero. There's a number between that we could compromise on. But how do you compromise on core issues of identity, like abortion, gay rights, even some things like immigration, right? And that, in some ways, is, you see it when you've had religious divides. Those tend to be the most polarizing because there isn't room for compromise.
I want to keep going with this discussion about where we are in polarization, but before that, take a little step back to the American Revolution, which, interestingly, you say was not really a revolution, which I think will come as a surprise to a lot of people. But your reasons for saying so are quite interesting.
Yeah, look, again, as I say, I mean, depends on how you want to define these things. In the terms I'm describing, which are complete transformation of societies, particularly from the bottom up, the economic and social relations that then have huge follow-on effects politically, the way the Industrial Revolution did, the way the current revolutions we're going through are doing. The American Revolution is really a war of independence. If you think about it, the American Revolution does not fundamentally transform the social relations, the economic relations that sit at the basis of society, and even in many senses, the political relations. So the entire slaveholding structure of the South is kept entirely intact with the Bourbon aristocracy, with the entire nature of this. Essentially, it's the only part of America that resembles feudal Europe, and it is kept entirely intact. But even outside of the South, the enormous privileges that accrued to white men who owned property were kept in place. There was an effort to have a kind of real revolution, which was the Whiskey Rebellion. But it's put down very, very brutally. And so you never get a reordering. Now, it is true that over time, some of these things did get transformed. I think that the Jacksonian period is one where you do get a greater democratization of American political power. But if you want to look at the period that really changes America from the bottom up in a revolutionary sense that I mean it, I argue it's the period from 1860 to 1880. That 20-year period, the Civil War, the end of slavery, the effort, not successful, of course, to break the power of the Bourbon aristocracy in the South, the transformation of America from an agricultural country to an industrial country, and the scrambling of politics that takes place around that time. The rise of the progressive movement, first the rise of populism, then the rise of progressivism. That's real change.
So, to give us a look ahead at where we're going to get in this conversation about our current scrambling of politics, what was that scrambling of politics, if you can do it in a minute or less, that took place during those 20 to 30 years?
So you always have to say, when you're dealing with America, and knowing that Annette Gordon-Reed is going to come on this program, I say this, I'm hesitant to even speak too definitively on anything relating to this, but race is always a special factor in American politics, and so you can't really put it aside. But for a moment, let me just talk about the way it scrambled politics in general in the Anglo-American world, which is that you start out with industrialization with the liberals, the merchants, in favor of it all, and the left basically urging it on, and the right suspicious of it because it's change. It means the end of landed aristocracies. It means the end of the power of the landed elites. And by the end of the industrial revolution, what you find is the roles have flipped. The left has gotten deeply concerned about the effects of untrammeled markets, and now the left wants more state intervention, controls on markets, regulations that limit the power of markets. And the right has got very comfortable with this new plutocratic elite, industrial elite, and it becomes the party of business and the party of free markets and things like that. And you see that transformation in America by the time of the Theodore Roosevelt presidency. Theodore Roosevelt is the last conservative, aristocratic, right-of-center politician who is pretty hostile to capitalism and sees his role as regulating capitalism. And if you look at him and you compare him to Coolidge, the Republican president only 10 years later, you see what has happened. The right has completely embraced capitalism, and the left, by the time you get to the 20s, particularly looking at Al Smith in New York, has completely embraced the idea that the role of the left is to in some way check capitalism. Now, as I said, what I've left out of this story is that there's a huge piece of American politics and partisan politics that has to do with your attitudes towards race. And that is the special, as Gunnar Myrdal called it, the American dilemma and the American tragedy. And I talk about that a lot in the book and how it plays in and plays out.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to look very far back in the rearview mirror to remember that it was the Democratic Party, which was the party of segregation, and the Republicans who were not, and that the Democratic Party has now much more so embraced the progressive cause and would be, if anything, would identify at least some of its members as anti-racist, which is one of those scramblings of position of viewpoints and alignments that you're talking about, which brings us to the present day. Let's talk a little bit more about the current scrambling, and I think it would be useful to set the table on this, to talk about the two meanings in our current context of the word liberal. There's a big L liberal and small L liberal, and I think it would be helpful for you to talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, the dominant use of the word liberal in my book, which is, by the way, the dominant use of the word liberal in every country other than the United States, is to mean the inheritor of the liberal Enlightenment project, which is the project that limits the power of kings and courts and an established church and creates a world in which individuals have freedom, have dignity, have autonomy, have economic power.
And its ascendancy was a revolution in itself that can be traced back to the Enlightenment, and as you were saying, comes through the Dutch Revolution, really given form and shape and reality.
It's the underlying basis for liberal, democratic, market-oriented societies that really have kind of transformed the world over the last 400 years. In America, it took on a particular context, which is, I would argue, within that liberal project. There has always been a debate among people who wanted more market and people who wanted less market, especially after the Industrial Revolution. And in America, we tend to mean by liberal, people who want to spend more, who want to tax more, who want to regulate more, and we mean by conservative people who want to do less. But as I say, that whole debate has gotten scrambled,
right? Because
you look at Donald Trump, right? He's against markets, he's against trade, he's in favor of big government spending. He still has some kind of I would say kind of libertarian twitches about lowering taxes, but for the most part, his populism is really the opposite of the Reagan formula, which was free markets, free trade, openness to immigration, celebration of all these forces that I'm describing, and a kind of general optimism that Reagan projected, where Trump is a deeply dark, pessimistic figure. He thinks America has been, gone down a terrible path. That's the sense in which he's fundamentally illiberal, because he views this liberal Enlightenment project, I think, with much more jaundiced eyes than somebody like a Reagan or a Clinton.
So are we in a period of backlash? Are we, when you talk about Donald Trump wanting to go back to make America great again, is that a backlash manifestation?
Oh, I think for sure.
I backlash against what, actually?
Yeah, so it's a backlash, as I say, about, particularly since the fall of the Berlin Wall. From the fall of the Berlin Wall to the invasion of Ukraine, 2022, you can say that period, about 30 years, was a period of extraordinary movement in terms of liberalization of domestic economics, of trade, democratization of politics. I mean, you had if you looked at Latin America in 1985, Latin America was run by almost every country was a military junta. By 1995, every Latin American country except Cuba had held elections. So the transformation in terms of liberalization, democratization, an information revolution that transformed societies and connected them, open platforms. In a way, the reaction is against all of that. The backlash is against all of that. But there is one central thing, and you can see it as the rocket fuel that propels right-wing populism in almost every country, and that's immigration. And my theory about this is that it's, in some ways, of course, immigration is about immigration. People don't want this much immigration, and I get that. But I think immigration has become a proxy for many of these larger changes, because how do you visualize or protest against the movement of capital around the world? Hedge fund managers around the world, rewarding and punishing countries by sending money and withdrawing money. How do you make tangible the idea of the international flow of goods and services, digital products? These things are all very abstractions. But human beings who come into your town, who look different, who sound different, who worship different gods, that's real. That's something that you can viscerally react to, and you can say, that's what's ruining my country. I want these people out. And Trump has very cleverly weaponized it, but it's not just Trump. If you look around throughout Europe, the rocket fuel for right-wing populism, the number one issue that the people who vote for these parties say, they are motivated by is immigration.
People who are opposed to immigration are often disparaged, labeled as xenophobic, narrow-minded, bigoted, and you don't apply any of those terms to those participating in that particular backlash. And I get a sense that not just for that group of backlashers, but for those who have lashed back to the way things were taking over centuries, that you have some empathy for them, or at least some generous understanding of what motivates them. Am I right about that?
You're absolutely right. I think that you have to recognize that there has been a lot of change. The forces I'm describing have been very disruptive. And even immigration, we've had a lot of it. And I say that as a proud immigrant. In 1975, America was about 4.5% foreign-born. In other words, about 4.5% of the country were foreign-born, therefore immigrants. Today, it's about 15%. If you look at Europe, the transformation is even more extraordinary. We don't have good data on this, but Sweden must have been, it was not an immigrant society. In 1975, it must have been 1 or 2% foreign-born. Sweden is today 21 or 22% foreign-born. So think of that transformation, particularly in societies like Sweden or France or Denmark or Holland, which are not immigrant societies. At least in the United States, we have a narrative that this is a society based on ideas. And as long as you subscribe to those ideas, it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is or the race or religion you come from. That is not the founding mythology of Germany or Sweden. The founding mythology of Germany and Sweden is we are a bunch of people who grew up in these forests and we worshiped these gods and we had the same ancestors. And that's why we are a nation. So, when you start see brown-skinned people from Morocco worshiping a different god who come from different places, who have different ancestors, it's jarring. So what I try to recognize is, look, it's a lot of change. And so let's give the most generous interpretation to what, people are overwhelmed. They're disoriented and they look at all that and they're looking for somebody to blame. I do blame the demagogues. I think, while I don't blame the people who feel overwhelmed and who feel disrupted and who feel anxious, I think politicians like Trump, I know, whether knowingly or not, weaponize these things, demonize people, and that's very sad.
I was living in London in the early 1980s, and I remember Margaret Thatcher clearly being slammed for using a phrase when she was describing white Britons reacting to an influx of Southeast Asians as who were members of the Commonwealth, so had right to live in the United Kingdom. Her phrase was, "People do feel swamped," and she was really ripped apart for making that comment. But it sounds, her phrasing almost sounds like what you're saying. It can be overwhelming, and again, you might accuse her of populism. But I find it interesting that your point is that folks experiencing those feelings and even giving voice to those feelings should not necessarily be condemned and labeled as bigots and narrow-minded.
Exactly. And I think that the concern about assimilation is real. And I think immigrants should assimilate to a certain degree. They are always also enriching the core culture by bringing something new to it. And that's partly the extraordinary benefits of immigration, is it brings a certain diversity and dynamism to it. But look, as an Indian immigrant who came here, if I wanted to simply recreate my entire existence and culture of India when I come to America, I should have stayed in India, right? I mean, the point when you come to a country is you accept that you are going to, in some way, find a way to assimilate into the broader culture that you're coming to, and you're attracted to that. That's why you're coming here.
As the world watches our culture go through this turmoil and this polarization, this dissent, this rise of what I think you would call illiberal tendencies, in which you've cited Donald Trump as maybe not the cause, but an active agent in the process. What does that do to America's standing, which has been for 70 years globally kind of we've been the flag bearer for liberal democracy. What's happening to our reputation and our ability to exert any kind of influence in this sort of soft power kind of way?
What's very sad about it, John, is that it's happening at a time when the United States is actually doing extraordinarily well in the world. If you look at America, economically, kind of the raw power of America, it's difficult to find a time in the last 50 or 60 years when it's been stronger. The United States and Europe were the same size economically in 2008 at the start of the global financial crisis. The Eurozone economy and the U.S. economy were the same size. Today, the U.S. economy is twice the size of the Eurozone economy. 30 years ago, U.S. wages and European wages were the same. Today, U.S. wages are 72,000. European average EU wages are 45,000. If you look at the largest companies in the world, they're all American. If you look at the largest banks, if you look at energy, the United States is now the world's energy superpower. We produce more oil than Saudi Arabia. We produce more natural gas than Qatar. We are demographically the only rich country that is vibrant demographically because of immigration. We have the same fertility problems that all advanced industrial countries have, but we take in 1 million people into this country legally, and that gives it enormous vitality. So you look at all that and you say, so this is, these are amazing cards to play. But what has happened is we've lost faith in ourselves. We've lost faith in that liberal enlightenment project. We are deeply divided, and a core part of that divide is people who say, as I say, it's a dark, pessimistic view of where America is. It's let's turn inward, let's become a fortress America, and it's very difficult to lead the world if that is your attitude. Again, contrast that with Reagan or Clinton, who in different ways represented that kind of sunny, assured optimism that said, let's keep moving forward. The United States will do fine, but we'll bring along a lot of other countries along the way.
But you look at what the Clinton presidency happened at a time when, in all ways, American power and influence was firing on all cylinders. The Soviet Union had collapsed. China had not yet found its footing as an economic power. There was, as you describe in the book, a unipolar world. We were it. There was one pole. It was our chance to lead. And now, clearly, that's not the reality any further. And how does that impact even the way that we're having this conversation about who we are?
Oh, for sure. It's a huge part of the story. Look, we don't like to think of it this way, but culture follows power. I grew up in an India that was very Anglophone. It was 20 or 30 years removed from British colonialism. Everybody looked up to Britain. All the fiction I read growing up was all, Dickens and Evelyn Waugh. I came to America. I had never read Fitzgerald. I had never read Hemingway because they were thought of as, kind of minor authors in the canon of English literature. And now India is mostly Indianized, but to the extent that there's any foreign country that casts a shadow, it's all America. And I saw this happen because in the 70s, the money dried up from Britain. So all the smart people used to go to Oxford and Cambridge. They started to go to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, So
you went to Yale. Yale was your choice.
I went to Yale.
Right?
I went to Yale. And I went there because, I could get a scholarship there. And 10 years earlier, the bright kids from my school had gone to Oxford and Cambridge because they had scholarships. And so when you look at the how power shapes the way you look at the world. The fact that we have returned to a great power competition. As you said, we've left the unipolar moment. We have a great power competition that is about hard power, but it's also about soft power. To me, one of the interesting things about writing this book was looking at the speeches of Xi Jinping and Putin. What I realized is they were not just talking about balancing against America's hard power. They wanted to balance against America and Western ideas. Xi and Putin together, and the Iranian mullahs share this, view Western liberal ideas as deeply corrosive and dangerous. They talk about how they don't want their societies to adopt them. They clearly worry. I mean, she has now been giving speeches about how women need to adopt a new conception of feminism, not the Western conception, in which, they're more family oriented, they have more children, they privilege home over work. Putin, of course, has been going on about this for a long time, about how Western liberalism is decadent and has created the seeds of its own destruction. So there is a kind of cultural war taking place, not just a great power, a return of great power attention.
When you looked back at history and you looked at the things would go in a certain direction and then there would be a backlash, ultimately there was a resolution. Ultimately, things calmed down or reached a new status quo. Do we know anything about, if we look at our current polarization and our identity politics, of which you're a critic, do you see a way forward to this polarization ultimately being resolved into something that's where there's more synthesis, where we're able to find common ground and get along?
I think there is a path. Look, I think that the mistake people sometimes make is to assume there is a future out there that we know that smart people are meant to be able to predict. Well, there is no one future out there. I mean, it depends on what we do. And one of the lessons I took from the book is you go through these periods of turmoil, you go through the change, you go through the backlash, and how you navigate through that really determines where you come out at the end. So you can navigate skillfully and find a way to balance the movement forward, but not go too far too fast. As I would argue that people like Franklin Roosevelt found a way to do through great crises. While at the same time, remember Roosevelt's enormous compromise that he made, which was that he never touched the power of the Democratic South. He never tried to really force change, to the whole Jim Crow setup, because he knew that he could only fight one battle and he needed the Southern Democrats. So it's a wonderful reminder that everybody is making compromises as you navigate through these periods. If you do it wisely, I think there's a path forward. You can do it badly. And the French Revolution, which takes up 50 pages of the book, is a classic example of political elites pushing too much change, too radical, too abstract, too far, too fast, and having a complete backlash. Or you look at the Iranian Revolution, which was a backlash to the Shah's modernization. They're in 37 years of backlash and still going strong. So I think there's no question it can end badly. Yeah. But I'm an optimist, and I think that there is a path forward.
So you've just answered the next question I was going to ask you, which is, do you think these are dangerous times? And I guess you're saying yes, but not necessarily fatal, that we're not in a sort of French Revolution style of hostility towards one another, or are we?
No, I think I'm optimistic. I worry a lot. The election in November is incredibly important in terms of whether you empower the illiberal forces or the liberal ones. But I think, in general, if there is a mistake that liberals make, I think it is to believe that history is on their side. And I don't mean by that if you look at the broad sweep of history over the last 400 or 500 years, certainly it has been one where it would seem as though, liberal ideas have moved forward. But the danger is complacency. The danger is thinking you don't have to fight for these ideas. It's important to remember the agency in here. If liberals don't fight for their ideas, and if they don't persuade people, and if they don't understand how disruptive some of their ideas are, they're going to find that the backlashes can overwhelm. So my message is, do this carefully, but you've got to fight. You've got to fight for your ideas.
As you mentioned that, I'm thinking, in fact, that you've debated with us in the past, as I've mentioned. We really try to bring people onto a stage or a place like this to fight for their ideas, but to fight in a sort of Olympic sports sort of way. Nobody's going to get hurt, and there's going to be rules, and there's going to be civility, and there's going to be a handshake at the end. But what's interesting is how often we find people refuse to have a conversation with somebody who disagrees with them. I'm not going to debate that person. I don't want to dignify their place on a stage. What's your assessment of that kind of refusal even to engage with the person on the other side?
Oh, I think it's fundamentally illiberal. I mean, I think what you guys do is actually, in some ways, a one of the many symbols of the liberal Enlightenment project. Because what is liberalism about? Liberalism is fundamentally about saying we don't know the answer, but we can set up a system that is fair and open and equal, right? The premise of liberal societies is we don't know who should be the ruler, but we're going to set up a system called elections, which allows for the process to be a fair way for people to choose. What is behind freedom of speech? We don't know the revealed truth. But what we believe is that by having an open, fair system, you will get to a better place. The contestation of ideas will get you to a better place than one person telling you or one group saying, I have a monopoly of wisdom and virtue, and you have to follow my way. So, and so often the illiberalism is precisely, it takes on a form that says, I know the truth. I have virtue. I have a monopoly of virtue on my side, and I don't need to engage in this elaborate system that you have created. And I do think that's fundamentally illiberal because it presumes a monopoly of virtue and truth, which is what liberalism is premised against. Liberalism historically grows out of the religious wars of Europe.
I'm here with Fareed Zakaria, journalist and host of CNN's Fareed Zakaria GPS, and we've been talking about his new book, Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash, from 1600 to the Present. And now I want to have some other folks join us in the conversation, and these are thinkers and writers who have been listening to the conversation and who think and write about the kinds of things that we've been talking about. And first up, I'd like to bring in Shoshana Zuboff, who is a scholar and a writer and an activist and also professor emeritus at the Harvard Business School, also has a book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power. Shoshana, thank you so much for joining us on Open to Debate, and please come on in with your question.
Thank you so much for having me, John. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And Fareed, I have admired the way that you do not eliminate complexity in your work as a public educator. I've always really enjoyed watching your show and listening to you. So it's a pleasure to be with you today. So you write about the information revolution, you write about the internet revolution, and this is a kind of language that surprises me, Fareed, because it really is a technologically centered language, as if it's the technology that is causing a revolution. So what I would like to suggest and ask for your thoughts on is that it's not information or the internet or the nature of the digital that is favoring inflammatory information and driving polarization. That in fact, as you're discussing Ronald Reagan a moment ago, that passion for open markets, free markets, radically free markets, corporations able to do whatever they wanted to do, that was an era where, as a result of that passion, our political leaders in the United States, beginning here, actually gifted the internet to private companies. So, Fareed, if I pose to you that we're talking about corporate power that owns and operates this milieu, even though we've never elected them to govern, I'd like to ask you, Fareed, can you think out loud with us about how do we cure the polarization that now infects the whole information space? How do we move to a different way of being an information civilization? And how do we do that by using our democracy, which at the same time is under threat from these very forces? I'd very much like to hear your thoughts on that and focusing on the power, the corporate power that drives this.
Shoshana, you ask a very important question, and as you know, if you in reading that chapter on the information revolution, I have been very influenced by your book. I think you're asking, in a sense, two questions. One is, to what extent is the technology of the internet itself, have these effects of, either democratization or empowering individuals or polarization? And to what extent is it actually all a combination of political power and ideology and policy choices that make it happen? And I do think that the technology has some powerful effects of its own that, of course, were allowed to play out because of certain ideological preferences. But look at my industry, media. So if you looked at the media space 40 years ago, it was basically a cartel. And it was a cartel at the highest level, where you had 3 networks, of 4 if you add PBS, and they had huge parts of the audience. And so they knew that they had lots of Democrats and Republicans as part of their audience and independents, and they had to present a kind of worldview that was straight down the middle, broad enough that it could capture all those people. And the people listening had no alternative but to go to those 3 places, right? And then you have basically the cable revolution, and then the satellite revolution, and then the internet revolution. And now people can choose where they want to get their news. And what has happened? What has happened is everybody chooses the news that they want to hear. So the first most important thing that's happened is most people, it turns out, don't want to hear about news. So when people say to me, what happened to the world of Cronkite and Edward R. Murrow and, even Tom Brokaw, when everyone was listening to the same news? Well, most of those people are watching ESPN. They're watching sports. They're watching entertainment. What you're left with are the politically motivated people. And they tend to choose among the hundreds of options they have, and they choose the silo that reinforces their views, doesn't challenge their views. That is a consequence of the technology, the 400 channels, the 50,000 websites, that everyone can go where they want. The people who were forced to listen to the evening news because that was the half hour before they got to their favorite sitcom, that world has gone and has been, kind of dissipated technologically. But then we get to, to what extent was that something that could have been guided? And I think it could have been guided a little bit better. I'm, totally agree with the arguments you make in your book. And I think, Section 230 is crazy and should be repealed. But now, so we get to the question of what could you do to try to limit the consequences of all this, which have been to create corporations that benefit enormously from this siloized, polarized partisan view. So there, I broadly speaking agree with the suggestions you have. I do wonder if I can be honest, how much effect they'll have, because look at Europe. Europe has no Section 230, and yet it has many of the same problems of polarization. India has no Section 230, and you have the sort of groups on the Hindu right who have powerfully been able to weaponize things like Twitter and Facebook. So I fear that the technology here does have a life of its own that has allowed for the empowering of organized minorities, organized pluralities that can weaponize their views, push them and spread them very far, very fast. And that what this technology does not allow for is that cartel-based middle. The people who kind of had to listen because they didn't have any other choice. The internet has sort of been the great unbundler. And a lot of what made our civic education possible was bundled products. If you wanted to watch ABC, you kind of had to listen to the news beforehand.
I have to say, as somebody who worked for the evening news on ABC, I hate to hear that people were forced to watch back in the 80s.
You didn't have a lot of choices. Yeah. You didn't have a lot.
Shoshana, thanks very much for your question. I really appreciate it. I now next want to bring in Annette Gordon-Reed, who is an historian and professor at Harvard, also a Pulitzer Prize winner, a National Book Award winner for her book, The Hemmingses of Monticello, An American Family. Annette, welcome to Open to Debate. Thanks so much for joining us. And what's your question for Fareed?
I'm glad to be here. My question is, are you optimistic? And if you are, why are you optimistic about the future of the United States? You mentioned that cultural problems, cultural differences are much more difficult, much harder to resolve than economic ones. And when people talk about Make America Great Again, what they're referring to is a time period when people of color, women, other people, marginalized people couldn't contribute to the conversation. What has happened is that as things have become freer for those folks, people feel threatened by all of that. So how can we can't have a compromise like FDR not signing on to anti-lynching bills and so forth in order to maintain the South. How can we survive? How do we get past this if without the kinds of compromises that may have been okay in the past, but are just not in the cards today? People aren't going to tolerate that today. And so we have this great diversity, which we saw as a strength, and it was a strength at a moment when essentially one group of people dominated over all of the other people who were out there feeling marginalized.
And I'd like, as an add-on to that question, is what Annette talking about actually very much the source of the tension that we're experiencing in terms of polarization today, fundamentally?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a great question. I don't think it's the only thing going on. As I say, I do think that underneath it, there's the economic anxiety, the turmoil, the dispossession, the fact that people who don't have college degrees, for example, just have no pricing power in the labor market anymore. It's changing a little bit, but if you think about over the last 50 or 60 years, that big shift. And I do think that a lot of this backlash is exactly as Annette says, a kind of a backlash against the rising power and presence of women and minorities and things. I think that as you know in the book, I argued that the feminist revolution is much more disruptive than people realize, much more important and much more disruptive, because it really changes a pattern that has been true for all of recorded history, that women were second-class citizens in every society, anywhere you went in the world. And we fundamentally upended that. So why am I optimistic? I think I'm optimistic because I believe that we are grappling with these problems, and we are grappling with these problems by airing them, not by repressing them, not by suppressing them. And a large part of particularly America are women and minorities and are having their voices heard and are going to be part of the kind of settlement that we arrive at. So as you say, Annette, it's impossible to do what FDR did because these people are not second-class citizens anymore. And I think that will lead us in interesting ways to a kind of settlement. And it may not be a settlement that you are completely comfortable with or I'm completely comfortable with, because that's the nature of a huge, messy democracy with 340 million people. So what is one of the things that I see as actually potentially a hopeful sign? It is the fact that Blacks and Hispanics are finding voice not just in one political party, and are therefore going to contribute to this kind of settlement in both. So why is that happening? As best we can tell, a bunch of Hispanics are discovering that given that we are in an age of cultural politics, on a lot of those cultural issues, they're quite conservative. These are God-fearing Catholics who have certain views on abortion and gay rights, obviously true of Blacks as well. And as a result, if they start voting over the longer run more, there's more, it's not a 90-10 divide, Democrat-Republican, it becomes 70-30 or 65-35. You will have to find some settlement. The Republican Party will not be able to engage in as much of the dog whistling as it has in the past. Democrats will have to understand that people can have differing views on this. So my optimism comes from the fact that, I really don't think we can go backwards. I think that isn't the option we have. But going forward, we're going to try to do it in a way we've never done before. We're really trying to build a kind of universal nation where everyone is participating, everyone is voice is at the table. And I guess this is the ultimate source of my optimism. The forces of sheer reaction and racism are actually in a minority in today's America. And I don't think that they will, they will be able to maybe every now and then you can trigger something and weaponize something, but ultimately they're not. This is a minority, and it's frankly a fading minority.
Annette, as the poser of the question, are you persuaded by that case for optimism?
Well, a bit, because I don't think we have very much of a choice to try to be as optimistic as we can. But it's a really difficult thing, because to go back is not going back to something, a world that was uncomplicated or not problematic. It just seems naive for people to think that you really do have to bring out that this sort of consensus was bought at the discrimination against lots of people. I don't think we have any choice but to go forward.
But I think I hear from Fareed a case being made that on these issues that actually go to identity and rights, that there can be a compromise between the old way and some new way. And I'm wondering, do you see compromise possible on such kind of transcendent issues?
Well, it depends. It depends on what if we're talking about voting rights, if we're talking about basic American, citizenship, there can't be a compromise on that. Mm-hmm. And I do think that what would have to happen is that you would have to persuade as many whites and other people, who have power, to go along with people, to have empathy for people who are feeling that they are marginalized. So it depends upon building the base of people who want a sort of a notion of Americanness for everyone. Yeah. And that requires changing some people's minds. And it happens. But I think you're right. I mean, compromise on basic values and basic citizenship rights can't take place. But there has to be sort of a broadening the pool of people who see a value in, Americanness for all people.
Let me suggest that one way to think about this may be that what I'm hoping for is a broadening of ideas that allow for some kind of, almost Marxian synthesis here. So if you think about something like, what is I don't want to say the biggest thing holding back poor blacks in America, but a central piece of it is the horrible education that they get and the unconscionable way in which the bottom quartile of American people, black, white, brown, are failed by the education system. Is there a way to find innovations that allow for greater choice, experimentations that allow for some way of breaking the monopoly of a school system that really has failed? I mean, if you look at the latest data, with $2 billion poured into the school system after COVID, it almost barely moved the needle on reading and math, which tells me we have to, all of us, come to realize it's not just about money. It's about the structure of the system that isn't producing. Or, on something like housing, one of the most shameful aspects of the United States, in my view, is that ever since Lyndon Johnson, we have never really tried to desegregate housing in America. Johnson tried. Nixon, when he comes in, reaps a white backlash to all of that. And nobody has ever tried. And we are still, in terms of how we live, we're about as segregated as we were in 1971, 72. And
yet you're optimistic.
Is there a way? Well, I think, again, that, maybe it's not such a good thing for all blacks or Hispanics to be in one party where they can be taken advantage of in that way, where there's, I'm just hoping that there could be some ways in which we get to more innovative new ideas that fall out of the old trap, but where you are now trying to cater to the rights of these communities, because, as I say, I do think what's different now is they can't be silenced, just as Annette was saying. They are not second-class citizens. They are first-class citizens, and they are part of both political establishments, potentially.
Annette, thank you very much for your question. I have saved time in the program for one more. So it's my pleasure to welcome Kathryn Cramer Brownell. Kathryn is author of 24/7 Politics, Cable Television, and the Fragmenting of America, from Watergate to Fox News. Kathryn teaches at Purdue. And Kathryn, thanks so much for joining us on Open to Debate, and please come in with your question.
Thank you so much for having me. I want to talk about something that I've found time and time again in my work as a historian on recent American media and politics, and especially in my book on cable television. And that is the incentive structures that are undergirding polarization as a political project and also as a business project. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about, what to do about the fact that so many businesses benefit from polarization, from stoking that outrage, as well as politicians and political parties have really built this in as a political tactic that they also benefit from.
It's a great question, because I do agree. Incentives are at the heart of this. Look, there's some of things you can't change that much. In terms of business, I think it's hard to change those incentives. But at the heart of this system, the incentive structure is built around two things. One, the redistricting of congressional districts, which means that you don't actually have to worry about a challenge from the center or the other side of the spectrum. All you have to worry about is a challenge from the more extreme wing of your party. So every Democrat increasingly the only challenge they really worry about is something coming from the hard left, and every Republican's only worry is something that comes from the hard right. And if you add to the redistricting problem the reality of primaries, which is related, you see that if the primary voters are roughly 10% of most voters, you're catering to the most extreme, the most engaged. So my big fix would be to try to end redistricting and force, kind of sensible districts that courts often have been able to do and nonpartisan boards have been able to do. And the second is to have open primaries for everybody. We're not going to be able to get rid of primaries, but what we could do is hugely change the incentive structure, because if every primary in every state is open, then all of a sudden you could face a challenge from a more moderate force. And it's not just a question of worrying about your left flank or right flank.
Kathryn, your thoughts on that response?
I think that that's something that a lot of scholars have pointed to as a clear solution. But what about the challenge of actually implementing it? Because those who benefit from the political system don't necessarily want to change the rules.
Yeah, this is like, why don't we expand the UN Security Council? Because the people who are on the Security Council who would have to vote for it are the ones who would be disempowered by that change. Look, I think that if you look at some states, increasingly what you are seeing is that they are moving in that direction. And I think this may be an area where you need a groundswell, where you need things like initiatives, where you need the public to come together and try to do something about this. Because you're right, the two-party duopoly is not going to do it, because the people in power have come to power through this very polarized and, I would argue, corrupt system. So, it's very hard to get the people who have benefited from it to change it. So we need a Hail Mary. And maybe the Hail Mary is the initiative.
Kathryn, thank you very much for your question. Fareed, I want to wrap up the conversation by just reflecting on the fact that you've been out on book tour for quite a while now, for several months. Just wondering, what have you learned from your journey through book tour land, which has taken you through many conversations in many cities?
Probably that everyone feels that they are living through revolutionary times, that they feel this sense of unease. They feel like they're losing something from the past, and they're wondering, how are we going to make all this work out? Most people don't like the polarization. Most people, I think, are searching for some kind of compromise or synthesis. But there's a great deal of uncertainty in the air. And I think one of the central reinforcing messages I got is people find this level of change, this level of progress, this level of revolution deeply unsettling and produces anxiety, even for people who are benefiting from it. I think we all look at this world and think to ourselves, my goodness, can this train stop at some point so that I can get off?
Fareed Zakaria, thank you so much for joining me today on Open to Debate. And again, I want to remind everybody listening that your book is called Age of Revolutions, Progress, and Backlash from 1600 to the Present. I also want to thank everybody who took part by asking questions, Shoshana, Annette, and Kathryn. Thank you so much. You got us to even more interesting places. One more time, Fareed Zakaria, thank you so much for joining us.
It was a huge pleasure, John. I really enjoyed it.
And a big thank you to our audience for tuning into this episode of Open to Debate. I want to remind you that as a nonprofit working to combat extreme polarization through civil, good debate, our work is made possible by listeners like you, by the Rosencrantz Foundation, and by supporters of Open to Debate. Our chairman is Robert Rosencrantz, our CEO is Clay O'Connor, Leah Matthau is our Chief Content Officer, Elizabeth Kitzenberg is our Chief Advancement Officer. This episode was produced by Alexis Pangrazi and Marlette Sandoval. Editorial and research by Gabriella Mayer and Andrew Foote. Andrew Lipson and Max Fulton provided production support. The Open to Debate team also includes Eric Gross, Gabrielle Iannicelli, Rachel Kemp, and Linda Lee. Damon Whittemore mixed this episode. Our theme music is by Alex Clement. And I'm John Donvan. We'll see you next time on Open to Debate.